Here we are. Good. Well, I'm a trade economist, and my take on the title A Road Less Travelled was immediately to think of the ancient trade routes, which were definitely travelled, I think, only by the brave, but which nevertheless probably made certain people very large fortunes, and others almost certainly ended up dead as a result. So a route less traded is very much a view, it's exploring one particular view, I suppose, of the world economy and the integration of different economies based upon trade. Now, we shouldn't think of trade necessarily as being something international or something that countries do with each other. It's more something that everyone does. It's almost just a microcosm of the whole economy. So whenever you sell your goods, your labor, whatever, and get money which in turn you spend in the shops, that's engaging in trade. Trade is something that enables us to specialize. It enables us to build up our own skills and to take advantage of the skills of others. It also enables us to take advantage of diversity of ideas, diversity of resources around the world. And even in ancient times, you had trade routes which were enabling, for example, Europe to take advantage of silk and spices. I'm not sure quite what the Chinese got in return, but we must have been giving them something, probably gold. Now, trade, therefore, is something that it's a human activity rather than being something we should necessarily see as being done by governments or between governments. In fact, the sort of extreme view will be that governments get in the way of trade, and that is perhaps a view that I'll be looking at as we go on today. But in some ways, that's unfair because to develop trade also requires the backing and the cooperation, particularly when it is longer distance of governments. It needs help. In the past, it needed help in terms of sponsorship for developing trade routes or for carrying out exploration, and more recently, in terms of things like legal backing, ensuring that currency actually matters, ensuring that you can actually do deals which are held to. Trading with your neighbours involves relatively little risk. Trading further away generally involves more, and that was perhaps never better summarized than on the ancient maps. I don't know if this one was the Mappa Mundi, but showing out there be dragons. I don't think any map actually said this, but that was very much the view. If you were going out into far-flung parts of the world in search of new spices or whatever, or gold, out there be dragons, you were very likely to come back dead. And maps of the world at the time did rather look like Tolkien's Middle-earth. Now that gradually has changed over time, both as a matter of people taking investment with risk, and also then people putting in money to develop, obviously to develop infrastructure, but also to develop relationships and trust between different people in different countries. The obvious case, 1492, Columbus discovers America. Well, no, he didn't. There were people there already. More to the point, Europeans had also been going there already, but hadn't made it generally public that they were doing so. I don't think it was that well publicized that the Vikings had been there. Maybe Welsh Breton fishermen were coming back with large amounts of cod. Columbus hung around the Keys and heard quite a lot before he persuaded the Spanish government to let him open up the trade route, which is what he did. And he did that, of course, with the backing of the Spanish government, who gave him all kinds of rights to him and others who followed, and backed by the Pope. Unfortunately, they didn't give him any rights to the locals, who suffered extremely badly in the consequence. But nevertheless, it brought us potatoes, it brought us tobacco, maybe not so good tomatoes, and big band swing. So quite a lot came out of this. Now, the era of globalisation really went forward and developed much more in the 19th century. By this time, it was more a matter of actually putting in infrastructure. So 1873, Jules Verne wrote Around the World in 80 Days. Rather a remarkable book because it couldn't have realistically been written 4 years earlier. It would have been science fiction, because in the interim, you'd had the opening of the Suez Canal, you'd had the Union Pacific Railway, extension of the freighter routes. It was actually possible, come 1873, theoretically, to go around the world in 80 days. Today, you could probably do it in much less than that, certainly. There was a hiatus in globalization, really between the two wars. If you want, there was almost a sort of anti-globalization movement in the form of nationalism within all the main countries. You got, obviously, the rising communism, fascism. You got countries like Britain were increasingly showing imperial preference, and trade actually stalled, went backwards quite substantially. So from 1946 onwards, really, the Western powers were quite determined that this wouldn't happen again, and there was a very conscious effort in the forms of setting up institutions to encourage the main Western countries, at least, to start trading more with each other. So you got the GATT, which became the WTO, various kinds of European agreements, obviously, and the World Bank, the IMF, to have a financial system to back it. And so from this period, you really got very fast growth in world trade, 6% per annum. That's a lot faster than the growth of the world economy as a whole. It's probably been the major driver. Now, a lot of the developing countries actually responded initially by trying to opt out. I mean, in some ways copying, in a sense, the nationalist agenda between the wars. They sought an autarkic developmental path, as of course the Soviet bloc was doing. So they tried to cut themselves off. And really, as time went on, part of the thing which has kept this trade snowballing is that the countries that did this have one by one learnt it just doesn't work. So the Berlin Wall came down. China, with the Communist Party staying in control, actually reversed many of their policies and haven't looked back. India, likewise. Latin America had actually, despite having politically right-wing governments, had been very anti-trade. And again, in the 80s, they just had to open up, faced with bankruptcy. And so you see this rapid growth in world trade, which actually eventually stalled in 2008 with the Great Trade Recession, but is now growing again. So that's really a picture. We live in a world of globalization. And many people would say this is like the second great era of globalization, the first one being before the First World War. And in this era of globalization, things are changing very rapidly. We are definitely aware that we're buying things much more globally branded, where you can see these large freighter ships coming mostly from China, but also from Bangladesh and so on, bringing goods. And likewise, there are technological goods and so on going the other direction. Now, it has obviously a huge impact upon all the economies concerned. And the impact is perhaps measured to us in terms of price. If you go down now, after the end of the multi-fiber agreement about a decade ago, you go down now to Primark, and you can buy a pair of jeans for £5. Primark, of course, is an Irish company. You might not know that. The jeans were probably manufactured in Bangladesh or Africa. Of course, it has other consequences, particularly with the speed of change. You can see Leicestershire is full, unfortunately, of derelict factories, although unemployment rates have not risen that much, I suppose, because people have been redeployed. But there is certainly pressure on some people's wages. But the alternatives really to doing this would either be that we pay a lot more than £5 for a pair of jeans, many times more, or that the wages of these workers would have to fall to Bangladeshi levels, neither of which is particularly attractive. So in a way, we shouldn't really be so surprised that we're globalized, because by and large, the evidence is that people who participate in global markets do much better than those who don't. Distance does, of course, impose a cost, but nevertheless, we can see that the cost of not being globalized will be huge. We will be paying more for many goods, and what's more, the cost of developing new technologies would be massive. Can you imagine what it would cost to develop the smartphone independently in each of many countries? You couldn't do it. And when it comes to environmental policy, we talk about it damaging the environment, but when it comes to environmental policy, you just couldn't envisage low-carbon technologies being developed at the level of small, isolated nation-states. So if you go to the meetings of the policymakers, the movers and shakers, the people who meet once a year in Davos, they wouldn't really be asking, why are we so globalized? They'd be asking, why are we not more globalized? They would be saying, we've seen huge benefits. And many of these people would say, actually, the benefits have taken many people out of poverty. The proportion of the world population living in poverty is falling. It has possibly given us the technologies which are now giving a handle on tackling environmental issues. So why hasn't it happened more? And there's some backing for this from trade economists. Now, we have a kind of rule of thumb. It started as an empirical model. In fact, it started as taking a model from physics. So we were looking at the gravitational pull between different planets, and much the same rule actually applies in terms of trade between two countries, or even between individuals and companies within countries. The larger you are, the more likely you're to trade. The further apart, the less likely to trade. Actually, it's pretty robust. If you double the distance between two countries, holding everything else the same, trade halves. And that's really quite useful. It seems to be a very strong rule. It applies within countries, trade between regions, and so on. So you get this decline over time, and over distance, and that makes sense. Because after all, it does cost more to trade long distances. And that probably is the major explanation why we don't buy all our goods from China. Nevertheless, there is one great exception to this when it comes to national borders. Even now, and we're well past the age of economic nationalism, even now we're in an age where trade declines, halving every doubling of distance until you come to a national border. But then there's a sudden 50% drop, and then the decline resumes. And it's that drop which, in a sense, is what is obsessing policymakers, and perhaps obsessing the people who advise them. We can observe it. We can see that it's bigger between some countries than others, and it can be affected by policy. So, for example, we know that where tariffs are reduced, there's some fall in this, but tariffs can't explain all the difference, nor can quotas and voluntary export restraint. And so, the policymakers and their advisors go scrabbling around saying, how can we explain this difference? Is there any way in which we could actually open these economies up more? And they look at things like border post efficiencies, queues, and so on. Yes, these are significant. But then they get into things like regulatory differences. And it begins to become complicated, and also currencies and so on. It begins to become complicated. Because in a way, they're beginning to look at areas which traditionally we've seen as being the prerogative of national governments. And this has started in a way with the European single market. We've begun to get into the prerogative of national governments, things like regulation and so on, and saying, hey, we've got to make these things more compatible so they don't actually impede people from trading, because it's hindering supply chains and so on. It is pushing up people's costs. And so you get attempts at standardization. You've had the single currency. You've had attempts by TTIP and so on. Now, for example, making many national purchasing, things like the National Health Service, open to legal challenge potentially from companies. But are we really misdiagnosing and mismeasuring things here? Well, here is an example comparing sales of cars in Germany and France. These are two countries which effectively have they've removed all regulatory barriers, there are no tariffs, they even use the same currency, there are no border posts between them. But you've still got a strong border effect. In Germany, VWs, you can see from the size of the badges, VWs outsell Renault about 6-1. In Britain or Switzerland, it's about 3-1. But in La France, it's the other way around. Renault outsell VWs 2-1. And as I say, I don't think there's anything obvious policy-wise that explains this. So to say necessarily that we need to keep on fiddling with policies, we need to overwrite more and more of the national rules and regulations and border controls and so on, may be premature. Maybe we're not actually, they will not make as much difference as we think. There's something else going on. And so, maybe some of these more controversial issues are actually quite dangerous. Maybe they actually threaten us with some kind of backlash, as we're possibly seeing against the euro now, which in a way could be throwing the baby out of the bathwater, because the trade that goes on and the liberalisation which have gone on have, I think, almost undeniably brought very large benefits. And I think that the rule is that actually we're being too impatient. I think that we've forgotten the old days of trade, that out there be dragons. We've forgotten that actually, engaging in trade is always risky when it's with someone new. That's even if the maps have been written, you've still got to actually go and find who the people are, what products they do, are they reliable to work with, how do you shake their hands? And you need to develop, relationships with them. And in the same way, when people start shopping for goods, again, they will stick to things which are safe unless they see a strong reason to change, and then they begin to build up new habits and new patterns of suppliers. Things in economics generally take much longer than we think. And it was best summed up to me by a Czech economist, a young Czech economist, who was talking about an Englishman and his Czech neighbour. And the Czech neighbour asked the Englishman, well, why is your lawn so much greener than mine? So the Englishman hands him a mower and says, mow it. The Czech comes back and says, well, yes, but it's not like yours. So the Englishman says, well, mow it every day for the next 300 years. And that's the message, I think, patience. Thank you.